Hello, and welcome to FFRF's Ask an Atheist. I'm Rebecca Markert, the legal director here at the Freedom from Religion Foundation.
And I'm Chris Line, staff attorney here at FFRF.
Many of you may be tuning in today expecting to see Desi Blake Love, who is slated to be today's guest. Unfortunately, she's not able to make it today due to a family emergency. We're working on rescheduling her and the episode, which was entitled Fundamentalism, Such a Drag, very soon. So instead, Chris and I were drafted to discuss an equally important and timely topic. Yesterday, the eyes of the nation were on Wisconsin as we went to the polls to elect a new state Supreme Court justice. As viewers may already be aware, when elections happen, FFRF gets a lot of complaints about churches and religious organizations getting involved in those campaigns. This election was no different. So today we're going to examine the topic of political campaign intervention by churches, and we're going to focus on a specific complaint out of our hometown here in Madison.
As always, we want to know what your questions are on this topic. You can ask them in the comments or send an email to askanatheist@ffrf.org. And remember, FFRF is a 501c3 nonpartisan organization, so we do not and cannot take sides in partisan elections and don't endorse any such views that might be expressed here. So,
Chris, I have been out the last couple of weeks because of spring break with my kids and other appointments that I had. So I'm really interested about today's topic because the complaint that you worked on, I'm not entirely familiar with because of my absence. So why don't you tell us a little bit about what happened last week and why FFRF got involved?
Yeah, so actually we got an email from one of our admin staff alluding to a tweet from Congressman Mark Pocan. Pocan was calling out that a church in Cottage Grove, right next to Madison, or technically basically a part of Madison, had put out in their bulletin, one of the pastors was trying to intervene in the Wisconsin Supreme Court election. And so we wrote to the IRS in order to try to get that resolved. The church was St. Patrick's Catholic Church in Cottage Grove, as I said, and in the weekly bulletin, the pastor had made some statements about abortion, and it specifically said, and this was the problem, not to vote for her in the election. So do not vote for her. As many people are probably aware, there was one woman and one man running in the election. So saying do not vote for her was clearly attempting to intervene in the election. And we have a lot of news places covered our letter and everything happened. And we have a clip that can kind of explain it to everyone.
With Election Day next Tuesday, one organization says a Cottage Grove church is stepping out of line in asking its congregants to not vote for a certain candidate.
Armand Rahman spoke with an expert to ask the question, did this church break the law?
Eric and Charlotte, one side, the Freedom from Religion Foundation, says the answer is yes, that taxpayers should not subsidize political speech from an entity that doesn't have to pay taxes. But a political expert tells me it's not so simple.
We have laws in this country, and churches are not above the law.
Annie Laurie Gaylor and the Freedom from Religion Foundation believe St. Patrick's Catholic Church in Cottage Grove broke that law with this March 26 bulletin.
We asked the IRS to investigate.
In it, Father Brian Dooley wrote to his congregants that next Tuesday in the election for Wisconsin Supreme Court, quote, "It's a moral sin to render aid to the cause of abortion. As a Catholic, I urge you, for the salvation of your soul, do not vote for her in the Supreme Court race."
That they were not to vote for Janet Protasewicz. Their salvation would be in danger if they voted for the person the priest didn't want them to vote for.
According to the IRS, all 501c3 tax-exempt organizations are absolutely prohibited from engaging in any political campaign on behalf of or in opposition to any candidate.
Leafletting and going door to door, they have complete ability as a voter to make their mark, but they can't use their church resources or their nonprofit tax-exempt resources.
But according to constitutional law expert Howard Schwaber,
this is complicated because we have to go back to basic principles. Not that many years ago, this would have been a very simple answer, but the courts have become increasingly unpredictable.
According to Schwaber, in this case, the government would have to justify to the court why it's treating a religious speaker differently than any other.
If your claim is separation of church and state, that's your justification, you're going to have to make that fit into a very narrow originalist, historically grounded notion of what that separation entails and doesn't.
A narrow notion, he says, has become more relaxed, especially with the current Supreme Court.
To not only allow, but require more and more public support for and public interaction with religious institutions in the name of neutrality.
And Pastor Brian Dooley with the church declined our request for an interview, but sent us a statement which reads, "Thank you for allowing me to clarify. My heart is filled with love for you and for our nation. My comments are coming from a place of love. I don't want anyone of any faith to suffer eternal fire in hell for supporting the killing of the unborn. You are in my prayers."
So I think we should break this down a little bit. So tell us, the law that they're talking about that we believe the church violated is known as the Johnson Amendment. So can you tell us a little bit about the Johnson Amendment?
Yeah, the Johnson Amendment was a law added to our tax code that requires that nonprofits, including churches, which are nonprofits, cannot intervene on behalf of or against any candidate or in any election. It's important. It helps guarantee that organizations like FFRF that get a tax exemption aren't using that untaxed money to advance politics. It helps for everyone, As I kind of alluded to in our opening sort of disclaimer, FFRF is a registered 501c3, and we take this designation along with the accompanying benefits and responsibilities very seriously. As you know, we sued the IRS in 2012 based on its failure to enforce the Johnson Amendment. That case ended successfully in 2014 after the IRS clarified who could authorize church audits and demonstrated it does have a process for enforcing its violations. Unfortunately, since that time, we've seen churches continue, like this one, to make a mockery of their 501c3 status by reaping all of the benefits while openly engaging in politics and endorsing political candidates in the way that this church did. And it's really frustrating here because, there's a lot the church could have done. If this thing had just said, we the Catholic Church are against abortion, that's fine. Churches can talk about issues in the same way that any nonprofit can advocate for issues. You just can't take it that one step further that they took it to say who to vote for. You can't connect all those dots up. You have to just speak on broad issues. That's permissible, but you can't actually intervene, tell people who to vote for, who to vote against, or do anything like that. That violates the law. And then when that happens, the IRS should take some action to warn the church. And if it keeps doing it brazenly, as we've seen a lot of churches do, they should lose their tax exempt status. They don't, we shouldn't have to fund with taxpayer dollars partisan political speech, turning churches into, sort of political action committees, except, I guess in the same way, churches don't have to necessarily explain where their money's coming from. So if we allow them to engage in politics, it's a way to funnel money into elections and nobody would know who's funding it. There's a lot of reasons why this is dangerous.
Right, and I kind of want to break down a little bit what you were saying before about churches being able to speak about issues, and they're also able to do a little bit of election work. Federal law does not restrict any 501c3 organizations, including churches, from engaging in any sort of nonpartisan speech or nonpartisan electoral activities, meaning that they can encourage congregants to go vote. They can also do some things that touch on politics, like providing members of the congregation with nonpartisan information about issues in an election, organizing voter registration drives, even hosting candidates as speakers, provided that each candidate on the ballot is given equal opportunity to participate, and holding discussions about the relationship between church doctrine and any of these issues that they find important. I think it's also interesting in this situation because a lot of the times when we've talked about this on this show previously and in statements FFRF has sent out, we've focused a lot on some of the national races, like federal and presidential races, because as I said at the outset of this show, during election years, we see an uptick in this type of violation that FFRF sends complaints out about. But what I think is probably less publicized is how we also get a lot of complaints about these organizations getting involved in local races. And of course, the state Supreme Court race here in Wisconsin was huge, and everybody in the nation was watching it. But it is not typically something that we've had to really get involved in before, though we have had churches, get involved in city council races and things like that. So I thought that was pretty interesting. But I also wanted to bring up the fact that we've tussled with the Catholic Church here in Wisconsin about getting involved in elections many, many times before. One of the first complaints that I worked on here at FFRF when I started in 2008 was about the Catholic Church doing the same type of thing, telling everybody that voting pro-choice was going to jeopardize their soul. And that is something that they've been doing for a long time. And while they can talk about issues, and the church can certainly tell you to fill out a postcard and tell your legislator, to vote a certain way on a specific legislative bill. When it comes in the context of election, this is becoming more and more problematic for them, because abortion really has become a wedge issue. And the IRS has in recent years identified these certain wedge issues to be ones that differentiate the candidates. And so a letter like this, even if they didn't mention Janet by name, and even if they didn't even identify, male, female, woman, man, something like that, the fact that they brought up an abortion 2 weeks before the election, the IRS would consider that to be illegal campaign intervention, because it now is a issue that differentiates candidates, especially in this most recent election in Wisconsin.
Right, especially in this case where, the statement, I believe, said something along the lines of statement about Supreme Court election. That would make it very clear, even if they had not named a specific candidate, you're calling out an election, and then making very clear, that you want people to vote for a certain side, which is inappropriate. Nonprofits work so hard, as we know, and other nonprofits we work with, we're really cognizant of these rules. And it's kind of frustrating that we work so hard to make sure we're abiding by it. And then you see churches kind of being pretty free with it, not really being that worried. I don't think most churches are super worried about anything happening, which is concerning. And, of course, that's one of the reasons why we're writing and trying to put pressure on the IRS, is that if they would just enforce some of these, particularly these bad ones, or very clear cases like this, then that would put pressure. As you said, there's some expansion going on. Now we're seeing churches getting more involved into the local level, not just at big national politics. Well, if the IRS would take some more public or clear action, actually take action against some of the worst perpetrators, that would send a message to all the others, that they need to stop doing this, and that would instill some fear and make it so that they're doing. Now, a particular concern for me is, this is a church, not necessarily us, but a nonprofit, but a church. Church has got a lot of benefits that we don't. So you would hope that they would actually be more vigilant in following the rules, because they actually have a better deal from the IRS than we get as a nonprofit. Secular nonprofits like FFRF, we have to demonstrate that we're spending our money on our mission. Churches and other religious institutions are under no obligation to do so. Churches and other religious organizations get the benefits automatically because they're a church. They don't have to apply to be a 501c3. It's not because of any charitable work they're doing. Now, that's not to say churches don't perform charitable work. They definitely do, a lot of them. But they're not required to in order to receive benefits. So for us or any other secular groups to become nonprofits, we have to meet all these requirements, filing requirements, Form 990 with the IRS, very stringent things to make sure that we are being a benefit to the public, and that's why we get those tax exempt status. Whereas churches just get to say we're a church. Nobody asks quite, the IRS doesn't get to go, and are you going to do anything helpful with that? There's like, nope, you're a church, you don't pay taxes. So I think it's even more incumbent on churches to follow the rules in that case and not abuse it and abuse our tax system. Otherwise they need to be taxed if they're not going to abide by the rules.
Right. And sort of along those lines, the Johnson Amendment is very, very popular, in studies. They say that 8 out of 10 Americans approve of this restriction on churches and religious organizations, and really all 501c3 organizations, not being involved in political campaigns. The other interesting thing that I always like to bring up when we're talking about this issue is that this is one of those issues where we are hearing from people who are actually churchgoers. A lot of the times when we are getting involved in these complaints, it's people who were in the pews on Sunday and were told who to vote for, and they're appalled by the fact that their priest or pastor told them that this is what they need to do. People generally don't like to be told who to vote for. You know, they want to make that old decision. They certainly don't want it tied to their salvation.
Yeah, but we've seen a lot of comments specifically on this this particular church thing. A lot of religious people weighing in and saying, "I would be incensed if my church did this," you know. Right. And you can also see, to kind of get to the other side of it, it's beneficial to churches and to nonprofits like us to have those rules in place. Yeah. Because otherwise, if we're allowed to participate in politics, suddenly you need to deal with the backlash when you don't. Or it could rip churches apart. You know, if church leadership maybe is leaning more towards one political party versus the other, now they may, rip their congregation apart as the congregation fights over, hey, our church should support this candidate. Hey, our church should support this candidate. And you kind of, a very basic principle that the intermingling of church and politics makes both, is detrimental to the government and to churches, Yeah. And the same would be true for FFRF. We don't want to wade into political politics because we want to focus on the issues that are important. We're for the separation of church and state, which unfortunately is often a bipartisan there are violations from many parties, from everyone. It's not like there is a particular group necessarily violating it. We have to complain about tons of different people violating these laws, which makes sense because our country mostly majority Christian, majority religious, and so there's never going to be one group necessarily tied with an issue. And so it's beneficial to not have to worry about wading into politics. So it's not even just a legal issue, it just practically is better to have the Johnson Amendment in place.
So I want to go back to Professor Schwaber, who was in that clip, and he was talking about the future of the Johnson Amendment and the current legal landscape. The federal bench, we know, has been radically transformed by the Trump administration, and state, church, and religious liberty issues are of increased interest to the court. And obviously in the last couple of years, everybody knows we've seen the damage that they've done to true religious freedom in this country. So let's talk a little bit about some of the points that he made in that clip, where he does see it to be vulnerable and that these organizations are brazen and are, like you were also saying at the beginning of this episode, that they really are flouting the law and openly sort of making a mockery of it. But they want this to go before the courts. So talk to me about that and let me know, what is the state of the law? Has this come up in courts before? Where are we?
Yeah, I guess I would just say he's not completely wrong to flag that, but I think the angle he's approaching it from is wrong. We deal with this with a lot of issues we do. So, for example, we deal with it with post-Kennedy stuff going on. People basically getting ahead of the courts, and we want to reflect that, the way the law works is we go off the current law. Yeah. We don't start basing our decisions, basing things that we do off of what we think the law might be or where the justices might go. We can only go off of what they've ruled, So in this case, the Johnson Amendment is still good law, and, the IRS should be abiding by it, Now, there is some question of whether that's going to change in the future, but that is for the future to decide. For now, we still abide by the law. We don't just go, oh, well, we think that the court might change this in the future, so let's just start breaking it now, and things like that. But the definitive case on political expression for nonprofits is Branch Ministries, Inc. versus Rosati. During the 1992 presidential election, Branch Ministries sponsored a series of advertisements in several major newspapers encouraging Christians not to vote for then-Governor Bill Clinton. On the basis of these ads, the IRS revoked the church's tax exemption. Branch Ministries appealed the revocation, arguing that the IRS had violated its right to free exercise of religion guaranteed by the First Amendment and the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. Then in 2000, it took a while, this 92 election, it took a while for it to get up through the courts, but in 2000, the Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit upheld the constitutionality of that ban on partisan political activity. The court rejected the plaintiff church's allegations it was being selectively prosecuted because of its conservative views, and that its First Amendment rights to free speech was being infringed. So that's sort of the last we've heard from a court on this, reaffirming that the Johnson Amendment is good and that it is not explicitly against sort of what the current courts have kind of started to do with religious exercise and that sort of thing, that there's no free exercise reason to allow churches to get out of this neutral law. And this is not a religious law. This is a law that applies to churches as 501c3s and to us. It's not really a religious issue. It's an issue of nonprofits who get tax exemptions being not allowed to participate in politics. The only reason religion gets involved in it is that these churches would then try to use that because it'd be their best way out of it. And unfortunately, as we've sort of talked about, Supreme Court's made some real bad rulings recently in that direction, sort of expanding the rights of churches and religious people to be exempted from all kinds of laws. So it is something we're worried about, but as I emphasized, right now the Johnson Amendment is still the law. Until courts as the Supreme Court overturns it, we need to enforce that law in the same way we enforce all our laws. That's how the rule of law works. We don't get ahead of it and try to anticipate what the court may or may not do, because it's not how our system works.
And it's important to note that churches do not have to be tax exempt. I mean, they could get involved in all sorts of political campaigns if they wanted, and they just don't take the tax exempt status and they pay taxes on their activities.
Yeah, so the D.C. Circuit actually brought that up in the Branch Ministries case. They said the church is free to not take tax exempt status and then they're allowed to participate in politics, but they also mentioned a couple other things. They could form a separate lobbying group. As many of our viewers probably know, FFRF recently launched a C4 that is a separate entity that has a little bit more ability to interact with politics and to be involved in that arena, and does not have that tax-exempt status that FFRF, the 501c3, has. So that's an option, or just other. I think the opinion also mentions political PACs, like political activity committee. I can't think of one.
Political action committees.
Action committee. Yes, thank you. Yeah, that another. There's ways, if the church really wants to be involved in politics, there's ways to do that without getting the tax. It's just, that's the issue,
right?
Is the wanting to participate in politics while getting tax benefits. So there's a variety of ways to separate that, and that's the solution here. And there's not really a religious free exercise issue. I mean, there's plenty of ways that the church can have it both ways. They just want extra. They're like, no, we would love all the benefits of being a tax-exempt organization, and we would also like to tell you who to vote for. And that's the problem, and something that the IRS needs to address. And we're going to keep pushing them to do that.
Right. Well, there is a few questions, or at least one question that I think is a good segue here, because we've written to the IRS about St. Patrick's in Cottage Grove, and kind of what's next. So Clay L. asks, has the IRS taken action against churches that do not engage in electioneering typically, or that do engage in electioneering typically? And what are the next steps for this specific case?
Unfortunately, as I noted, we were only aware, I believe, of in the last, 20 years, maybe 3 or 4 instances of church publicly being, which kind of makes sense. The problem is this is not a public thing, so which touches on the next part, which is that I believe we sometimes are getting a form sort of response from the IRS letting them know that they got our complaint, but unfortunately it's a non-public process, so we don't get to, they were not going to tell us whether they sent a letter to the church, what they said to them, whether they're investigating it. Unfortunately, we don't get to know that. The only way that it would become clear that action is being taken is if, in like the case of Branch Ministries, came out publicly, you know, that this
Right.
was happening.
So they do, you're right, they have typically in the past sent us a letter that is a form letter that says, it's basically an acknowledgement of a receipt of the complaint that we sent them, but then they cite that due to taxpayer privacy, they are not allowed to give us personally the results of any investigation that they do undergo. But the IRS has in its past released a list of organizations, including churches, that have had their tax exempt status revoked. And so you can kind of figure out what they're doing there. Obviously, in the last Congress too, the Congress gave a lot more money to the IRS for enforcement actions. And so we are hoping that some of that goes to these types of investigations. But normally we are not able to, like you said, get the results of these investigations. But that's typically how it goes from here. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't continually complain about what they're doing here. If they're breaking the law, we certainly want to notify the IRS.
Yeah, and we're certainly not going to see the IRS taking more action if we don't do anything or say anything.
Right.
Because we know the churches are going to keep complaining and trying to push their agenda, and so we need to stand strong and say, hey, this is violating the law, you need to do something. Like, we have tasked you, IRS, as the organization to handle this. The law is clear, and you need to do something. And that's what we're going to keep doing, is pushing the IRS and trying to find new ways even to make sure the IRS takes the action that they need to in these cases, and that churches either follow the law or they lose their tax exempt status.
Right. There's another question. So Michael T. writes, if the Johnson Amendment isn't enforced, is there anything to stop nonprofits, oftentimes churches, from engaging in political interference like this?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure. You know, I think obviously, as I sort of noted, most churches and nonprofits don't want to. So I think there's going to be, even without the threat of the law, I would guess a majority of even churches are abiding by this and will continue to do so. So that's one aspect. So that you really just get the sort of worse violators who are willing to violate the law that are out doing it, but I think there's a lot of self-regulation going on. And I think that's the way FFRF would handle it. I mean, truly, if at some point the Johnson Amendment were struck down in some way, or you know, a law was passed to get rid of it, something along those lines, I think the FFRF would most likely voluntarily be sort of following the same rules. It's not a situation that we would necessarily jump into.
Well, I also think that a lot of it is self-policing, like you say. I mean, they don't want to take these risks. I mean, especially the smaller churches. But I also think that people, like I had mentioned before, people really like the Johnson Amendment. They get really upset when these types of things happen towards elections. And so just the fact that, a representative, Mark Pocan, called them out publicly about it, that is becoming more and more common. And I think it's important also for us to keep this sort of in the media and in publicity so that people know that what they're doing is wrong. And also congregants need to speak up too, let your pastor know you don't want to hear this when you go to church.
So I'll say, the diocese that oversees St. Patrick's Church did put out a statement basically saying, yeah, he violated our rules. Now, to what extent they're going to do something about that or, reprimand him or try to get that corrected is another thing, but that is another, opportunity. So the diocese even is admitting that was not the way that they believe that this should be handled.
Right.
And so, different groups, and like you said, that's from the top down, but also from the bottom up, congregants should be letting them know, like, hey, we don't want you participating in politics in this way. That's not what we're here for, and everyone can kind of help enforce this.
Yeah. Well, we don't have a lot of questions today, and I think it's because a lot of people were expecting a different show. So sorry about that, but thank you for tuning in. That does probably conclude our show for this week. Thanks to Chris for coming in and pinch hitting with me today. This week on our broadcast TV show, Free Thought Matters, our guest is William Bernstein, author of The Delusions of Crowds. Here's a preview.
People are now, for the very first time, self-segregating themselves geographically. So, it used to be when you lived in a town, there was the rich banker, there were the working people, there were the ne'er-do-wells, and everybody sort of lived together. And you had to come to a common agreement in the body politic about how things would run with very different people. Well, what is now happening in the United States is that people are self-segregating themselves by culture and political belief geographically. So if you're a liberal, you're not going to move to Lubbock, Texas, okay? And if you're an evangelical conservative, you're not moving to Portland, Oregon, or Manhattan.
You can see Free Thought Matters on TV stations all across the U.S. and also on FFRF's Facebook and YouTube channels.
And don't miss Free Thought Radio. This week, Annie Laurie and guest host Amit Paul will feature a recent Bill Maher defense of atheists. You can find out how to hear Free Thought Radio at ffrf.org/radio.
And be sure to catch the latest episode of the We Dissent podcast, where Allison Gill, Liz Cavell, and I talk with Sasha Buchert from Lambda Legal about the assault on civil rights of trans people. You can find that anywhere you get your favorite podcast or online at we-dissent.org.
If you want more information about the Freedom from Religion Foundation, check out our website at ffrf.org. If you're a member already, thank you. If not, please join. See you next week on FFRF's Ask an Atheist.